I knew the moment I walked into my classroom that Thursday morning that something was different. Not the room. The room was exactly as I'd left it the afternoon before. The desks still arranged in their imperfect rows. The alphabet border starting to peel at the corner near the window. The smell of dry erase markers and old carpet that I'd stopped noticing years ago. No, the room was the same. It was the feeling. That particular stillness that sometimes settles before something breaks. I'd been teaching for 11 years at that point. 11 years at Ridgeway Elementary, 3rd grade, room 14. Long enough to know the difference between a hard day and a day that changes you. Long enough to have developed a kind of instinct. Not always reliable, not always right, but real. The kind of thing you can't explain in a staff meeting or justify in a disciplinary report. I set my coffee on my desk and looked out at the empty chairs. 22 of them. 22 kids I'd been responsible for since August. And it was now the second week of November. By this point in the year, I knew them. Not just their names and their reading levels and which ones needed extra time on tests. I knew them. I knew that Marcus always tapped his pencil 3 times before he started writing, like he was warming up an engine. I knew that Priya cried silently when she was frustrated and would never admit it. I knew that Dominic, who'd moved here from Atlanta in September, still ate his lunch alone, even though he'd laugh loudly and easily with anyone who talked to him. I knew all 22 of them. But there was one I'd been watching more carefully than the others, and I'm not sure I could have told you exactly why. Not yet. Not then. His name was Eli Marsh. 8 years old. Small for his age, with these serious dark eyes that tracked everything in the room, not restlessly, the way some kids do, scanning for stimulation, but carefully, deliberately, like he was always taking inventory. He'd been in my class since the first day of school, and for the first few weeks he'd seemed unremarkable in the way that sometimes worries you more than the obvious cases. Quiet, compliant, never in trouble. He did his work. He turned things in. His reading was grade level, his math slightly above. On paper, Eli Marsh was fine. But there was something. I couldn't name it in September. I couldn't name it in October. It was more like a texture than a fact. Something slightly wrong in the grain of things. The way he sometimes flinched when a door slammed in the hallway. The way he watched the clock on Friday afternoons with an expression I'd have called dread if I'd seen it on an adult's face. The way he sometimes came in on Monday mornings moving carefully, like someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. I noticed. I told myself I was reading into things. I told myself that quiet kids are just quiet. That careful kids are just careful, that I was projecting. I went back and forth on it for weeks. That Thursday morning, he was the third one through the door, and he said good morning the way he always did. Polite, precise, a little formal for an 8. He hung up his backpack and sat down and opened his reading book to exactly the right page without being told. I watched him do it and felt that thing again, that unnamed texture of wrongness. And I made a decision that I then immediately talked myself out of. I would check on him at recess. I didn't. There was a situation with another student, and then I was pulled into a brief conversation with our instructional coach. And by the time recess was over, I'd lost the thread of the impulse. This is something I've thought about many times since. Not with guilt, exactly. But with an awareness of how fragile moments are. How easily they slip. That afternoon, during quiet reading time, I was circulating the room and I passed Eli's desk and glanced down at his book and noticed that he wasn't reading. He was holding the book open in front of him, but his eyes weren't moving. He was staring at something on his desk, or maybe at nothing at all, with that careful stillness of his, and I almost kept walking. I almost let it go again, but something made me pause. I crouched down beside his desk, which is something I always do when I talk to the kids 109. So I'm at their level rather than looming over them. Hey, I said quietly. How's the book? He looked at me. And for just a fraction of a second, one of those moments so brief you doubt it afterward. Something moved through his expression. Something that looked almost like relief, and then immediately like fear. Fine, he said. It's good. I looked at his desk. On top of his reading journal, almost hidden under the corner of his book, there was a small drawing. I only caught a glimpse of it before he moved his arm to cover it, but it was enough. A house, stick figures, and something dark. A scribble of heavy black lines that felt frantic in a way that was completely unlike the neat, careful way Eli did everything else. "That's a cool drawing," I said. He didn't say anything. "Did you make that today?" He shook his head. I wanted to ask him more. I wanted to ask him what was in the drawing, who the stick figures were, what the black lines meant. But I also knew from training, from experience, from everything the school system had taught me about the proper chain of reporting, that I was supposed to follow a process. I was not supposed to interrogate a student alone. I was not supposed to make assumptions. I was supposed to note concerns, document them, refer them to the school counselor, and let the system do what the system was designed to do. There was a process. There were rules. I stood up. "Keep reading," I said, as gently as I could, and I moved on. But I didn't stop thinking about him. Our school counselor was a woman named Barbara Yu, good at her job, genuinely caring, but stretched impossibly thin across 700 students in every crisis the building could generate. She had a whiteboard outside her door with a sign-up system, and the wait to see her was sometimes 2 weeks for non-emergency referrals. There was also a formal observation form, a request for student support. It's a document that had to be submitted through our online system and was then reviewed at the weekly student support team meeting, which met on Wednesdays. It was Thursday. I pulled up the form that evening at home, sat with it for a while, filled in Eli's name, his grade, his teacher. Got to the section marked observed behaviors, concerns, and started typing. I typed for a few minutes and then read what I'd written back to myself and felt the inadequacy of it. How do you document a texture? How do you describe an expression that lasted half a second? How do you explain the way a child holds a book without reading it and makes you feel, in some bone-deep way, that something is very wrong? I submitted the form anyway. Wednesday felt very far away. That night, I lay awake longer than I should have, which was unusual for me. I'm not generally an insomniac. Teaching 3rd grade requires a certain amount of surrender to exhaustion. But I kept thinking about Eli's face when I'd crouched by his desk, and about the drawing, and about Friday being tomorrow. He had looked at the clock on Friday afternoons with an expression I'd called dread. I told myself I was catastrophizing. I told myself I didn't actually know anything. I got up and made tea and sat in my kitchen and thought about the 11 years I'd spent in room 14 and the hundreds of children who'd passed through it and the handful who'd stayed with me in a particular way. The ones whose names I still thought about sometimes, wondering how they were. I thought about a girl named Trisha I'd had in my 2nd year of teaching, who'd come to school in January with bruises on her wrists, and how I'd followed exactly the right process. Documented everything correctly, submitted the referral. And by the time the system moved 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the grinding gears of institutions, her mother had taken her out of the district entirely. I never found out what happened to Trisha. I thought about that, and then I tried to stop thinking about it and went back to bed. Friday was a cold, clear day in early November, the kind of morning where the sky looks almost aggressive in its blueness, and the air has that sharp, particular smell of approaching winter. I drove to school with the radio off, which I sometimes do when I'm thinking, and I arrived early enough that the parking lot was nearly empty. I taught that day the way I always taught, fully, attentively, with whatever part of me is capable of being entirely present in a room of 22 8-year-olds. We did word problems in math, and Marcus tapped his pencil 3 times. Priya cried silently over a subtraction error and wiped her face with the heel of her hand when she thought no one was looking. Eli sat in the 2nd row and did everything correctly and said very little and watched the clock. At lunch, I sat in the teacher's lounge and ate a sandwich and thought about what I actually knew versus what I was afraid of, which are very different things. What I knew, a quiet child, a drawing I'd barely glimpsed, a form expression that might mean 100 different things. What I was afraid of, something I couldn't let myself think about directly, After lunch came the final stretch of the afternoon, and then dismissal, and as the kids filed out, I watched Eli. He went to his backpack hook with that same careful, deliberate movement, took down his bag, put his arms through the straps. He didn't say goodbye the way most of the kids did. He just went to the door and then paused for a moment, I don't know why, and looked back at me. The look lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then he was gone. I stood in my empty classroom for a few minutes after the last student left. The afternoon light was going orange and low through the windows. I thought about calling someone. I thought about calling my sister, who was also a teacher and who I talked to most weekdays. I picked up my phone and then put it down. I thought about what I had, a feeling, a drawing I hadn't fully seen. I thought about Trisha. I went home and spent the weekend not entirely present in my own life, which my partner Daniel noticed and asked about, and I told him I was just tired. He accepted this, because I am sometimes just tired, and because I didn't know how to explain the thing I was feeling, which had no name and no evidence and no legitimacy in any form that could be submitted to anyone. Monday morning, Eli came in and said good morning and sat down and opened his reading book to the right page. I watched him more carefully than usual that day, and I saw nothing concrete, nothing I could point to. He was a quiet child, sitting quietly in a classroom, doing everything right. But on Tuesday, and this is where everything begins to change. On Tuesday something happened that I've replayed in my mind so many times since that I'm no longer entirely sure of the exact sequence. I'm sure of the essential truth of it, but memory is not a recording, and I want to be honest about that. We were doing a creative writing exercise. I asked the class to write about a place that made them feel safe, a place where they felt happy and comfortable. It's an assignment I do every year because it's generative and personal, and it usually produces some beautiful small pieces of writing that tell me something true about each child. I gave them 20 minutes. When I collected the papers, I held Eli's for a moment before reading it. I don't know why. Just that instinct again. Then I read it. He had written about a tree. He described it with unusual specificity, the way the wood felt under his hands, the particular quality of light that came through a gap in the boards, the smell of pine and old leaves. He wrote that in the treehouse he didn't have to worry about making noise. He wrote that in the treehouse everything was quiet. And then, at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, in his small, neat handwriting, the treehouse is the only place where I am not scared. I read that sentence 3 times. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my desk drawer and spent the rest of the day teaching and moving and doing everything a person does on a normal Tuesday, while carrying that sentence around inside me like a stone. The only place where I am not scared. An 8-year-old wrote that. My quiet, careful, clock-watching student who flinched at slammed doors. After school, I sat at my desk for a long time. I took out the paper and read it again. I thought about the proper process. Bring this to Barbara. Present it at Wednesday's support team meeting. Let the system work. I thought about the fact that Wednesday was tomorrow. I thought about how the wheels of the system turned. I thought about the drawing, the heavy black scribble. I thought about the way he'd looked back at me from the doorway on Friday. Because it sits in a part of my professional life that's complicated and painful and is never fully resolved. 6 years earlier, a child in another classroom at Ridgeway, not one of mine, had been in a situation that several teachers had noticed and flagged and processed through the correct channels. The situation had been documented, referred, reviewed, investigated. And during that investigation, during the weeks it took for things to move, the child had been hurt again. Badly. She had recovered. She was okay. But the 6 weeks it took the system to act, 6 weeks during which everyone followed every rule correctly, those 6 weeks were not recoverable. I've thought about that for 6 years. I sat at my desk with Eli's paper in my hands and I thought, what do I actually know? Okay, I know a child said he is scared. I know he is scared in every place except a treehouse. I know that is not normal. I know that is not okay. I also knew what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to take the paper to Barbara in the morning. I was supposed to fill out an addendum to the referral I'd already submitted. I was supposed to let the student support team review it on Wednesday. I was supposed to trust the process. I sat with all of that for a long time, and then I did something I had never done in 11 years of teaching. I took Eli's writing exercise out of my desk drawer, tucked it into a folder along with my notes from the past 2 weeks, the observations I'd been quietly logging in my own notebook, just for myself, and I drove to Child Protective Services. Not as a mandated reporter filing a formal report through the school system. I had already done that, technically, through my referral form, which would flag automatically. What I did that evening was go in person to the CPS office, which closed at 5, and it was 4:43, and I asked to speak with a caseworker about a child I was concerned about. I brought the writing, I brought my notes, I told them what I had observed. This was technically outside my role. A teacher is a mandated reporter. YEs, but the protocol is to report through designated channels: the principal, the counselor, the formal system. What I had done was go around that system. I had taken information directly to an outside agency without informing my principal first. Without going through Barbro. Without waiting for Wednesday. If anyone found out, there would be consequences. I knew that when I walked through that door. The caseworker I spoke with was a woman named Sandra. She was probably my age, mid-30s, with the particular expression of someone who has heard a great many things and is no longer easily surprised, but is also not, in any sense, indifferent. She read Eli's writing. She read my notes. She asked me questions, careful, specific questions, and I answered them as honestly as I could. She said, "I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I want you to know that what you brought me matters." I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a while before going inside. Daniel asked how my day was. I said, fine. He could tell it wasn't, and he let it go, which is one of the things I love most about him. Wednesday morning I went to school and taught my class and waited. I didn't tell Barbara what I'd done. I didn't tell my principal, whose name is Glenn Harker, a man I respect enormously and who has always been fair with me. I taught my class and circulated the room, and when I passed Eli's desk I felt the weight of what I'd set in motion, and also the weight of what I didn't know whether it would matter. Whether I'd been right, whether I'd risked my job for a child who was, in the end, simply a quiet child who sometimes felt scared. Everyone feels scared sometimes. But not like that. Not the way he'd written it. Wednesday came and went. Eli was absent on Thursday. When a child is absent, you note it. You enter it in the system. And if there's no communication from home, you send a note or make a call. I sent a note Thursday morning through our automated system and called the home number in his file on Thursday afternoon. No one answered. The voicemail was a generic recording. I left a message. I don't know how to describe the weekend that followed. I functioned. I went through the motions of a normal life with Daniel and our dog, and the ordinary textures of Saturday and Sunday. But underneath all of it, constantly, was the awareness of 2 days of absence and 2 unanswered phone calls, and a child I hadn't seen since Tuesday, who had written that he was only safe in a treehouse Monday morning. I arrived at school early and went directly to Glenn's office. I told him everything. I told him about the drawing I'd glimpsed, the writing exercise, my notebook, the form I'd filed, the visit to CPS. I told him all of it without softening or justifying. I put Eli's paper on his desk and my observation notes beside it, and I sat and waited. Glenn read everything carefully. He is a quiet man, Glenn Harker, not cold, not distant, but measured. He doesn't react quickly. He sat with the papers for a long time and then looked up at me. "You went to CPS directly," he said. "Yes," without coming to me first. "Yes." There was a silence. The kind that has weight. "Why?" he asked. I told him about the girl 6 years ago. I told him about Trisha. I told him that I had followed the process before and watched it grind forward slowly while children waited. I told him that I had read Eli's writing and looked at it honestly and felt, in the deepest part of my professional judgment, that waiting until Wednesday was not acceptable. Glenn looked at me for a moment. Then he picked up his phone. He called Barbara. He called the district office. He made the calls that would have been the next steps in the process I'd bypassed. And then he said, "I need you to understand that what you did was a deviation from our protocol. I have to document it. Depending on how this plays out, there may be formal consequences." "I understand," I said. "But," he said, and paused. "What you brought to CPS last Tuesday? A caseworker made a home visit Thursday morning." I went very still. "There was enough there," he said, "to act on." He didn't tell me everything. He couldn't, legally, and I understood that. What I understood was that something had been found. Something real. Eli was not in school that week, or the week after. When children are removed from a home, they don't come back to school immediately. There are placements, transitions, paperwork, the grinding gears of another system. I knew this abstractly. I now knew it in a particular and very personal way. I taught my class. I continued to teach my class. Marcus tapped his pencil 3 times. Priya cried silently over hard problems. Dominic ate his lunch alone and laughed easily when anyone spoke to him. I waited. There is a long stretch of time here that I want to be honest about. Because I think the most truthful thing I can say about it is that it was hard in a way that was quiet and private and had no dramatic shape. I wasn't a hero in any obvious sense. I had done a thing that might have helped, or might not have, I didn't know yet, and I had done it by breaking a rule. And now I was waiting to understand the consequences of both. Glenn documented the protocol deviation. There was a meeting with the district HR office. There was a conversation about my conduct and the importance of following mandated reporting procedures. I was not fired. I was not formally disciplined in a way that would follow me. But I was told, clearly and carefully, that what I had done was outside my authority. That the system existed for good reasons. That going around it created liability and confusion and undermined the protocols that were designed to protect children. All of that was true. I sat in that meeting and accepted it. And I thought, I would do it again. Not because I'm certain the system is always wrong. I'm not. The system exists because individual judgment is imperfect. Because teachers can be mistaken. Because children can be misread. I know all of this. But I also know what I knew that Tuesday afternoon in my classroom, sitting with a piece of paper in my hands, looking at a sentence written by an 8-year-old boy, the only place where I am not scared. You read something like that and you either act on it or you don't. You either trust what you know or you don't. I have been wrong before. I might have been wrong about Eli, but I wasn't. 3 weeks after Eli left, I received a very brief email from the CPS caseworker, Sandra. That was professionally worded and contained very little. It simply acknowledged that she had received my earlier contact and that the matter had been addressed. That was all. It told me almost nothing. But it told me something. In January, a new student joined my class. She came from a different district, moved into the area over winter break. Her name was Lily, and she had nothing to do with Eli except that she sat in the chair that had been his. Which I hadn't thought about until she sat down in it on her first day, and I felt something strange and circular move through me. I watched Lily. I watched her the way I watch all new students at first. Calibrating. She was fine. She was a normal, lively, slightly chaotic 8-year-old who talked too much and lost her pencil constantly and loved fractions in a way that was unusual and delightful. She was fine. Winter moved toward spring. The alphabet border stopped peeling and I taped it back up. We did our winter writing unit, our multiplication facts, our biographies of historical figures. Room 14 continued being room 14. And I continued being the teacher who broke a rule. I hadn't told anyone about it except Glenn and Daniel. It wasn't something I talked about at staff meetings or mentioned in casual conversation. It had happened and I lived with it. And mostly what I lived with was uncertainty. Uncertainty about whether it had mattered, about whether Eli was okay, about whether the thing I'd done had been brave or reckless or some tangled combination of both. There is something particular about not knowing. About acting and then having to simply continue, without confirmation. I had made a decision in a moment of private conviction, And then the moment had passed and the decision had consequences I couldn't fully see. And I had to keep teaching and grading papers and making sure Marcus had sharp pencils, and Priya felt seen even in her quiet moments. Life doesn't arrange itself into a shape where you understand what you've done. March came. It had been almost 5 months since that Thursday in November when I had walked into room 14 and felt that unnamed sense of something wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of March, 20 minutes before dismissal, and the kids were doing independent reading. I was at my desk entering grades. The classroom was quiet in that easy, settled way it sometimes gets in spring, when you've all been together long enough to have a rhythm, a language. I heard someone knock on my classroom door. I looked up. Barbara was in the doorway. She had an expression I couldn't read. "Can you step out for just a minute?" she said. I told the class to keep reading Marcus, pencil down, please, and stepped into the hallway. Standing in the hallway, next to Barbara, was a woman I didn't recognize. She was probably in her early 40s, with brown hair and the kind of eyes that look like they've been through something significant and come out the other side. She was holding the hand of a child. The child was Eli. He looked different. He was wearing a striped shirt I'd never seen, and his hair was a little longer, and there's no other word for it, he looked lighter. That's the word I've always come back to. Not happier, exactly, or not just happier, but lighter, as if something had been removed from him that had been very heavy for a very long time. He looked at me. "Hi, Eli," I said. And then, because I wasn't sure what else to do, I crouched down to his level the way I always did. He said, "Hi, Miss Calloway." The woman beside him, I would learn, moments later, that her name was Renee, and that she was his foster mother, said that they were just passing through the area, that she'd wanted to stop by and see the school, and that Eli had asked if he could say hello to me. He had asked to see me. I looked at him for a moment and I felt something in my chest that I don't have a precise word for. It's in the vicinity of relief and love and grief all at once, which sounds impossible but isn't. "How are you doing?" I asked him. He thought about this with the same deliberate seriousness he'd brought to everything. Then he said, "Better." One word. Small and exact and entirely sufficient. We stood in the hallway for maybe 5 minutes. Renee asked about the school, about the class, politely filling space. Barbara hovered. I kept looking at Eli, taking inventory the way he used to take inventory of everything in my room, looking for the things I needed to know, finding them. He stood differently. He breathed differently. He met my eyes in a way he hadn't used to, directly, without that fractional hesitation of someone who has learned to make themselves small. Before they left, he pulled something out of the pocket of his jacket. It was folded into quarters, the way kids fold things when they don't have an envelope. He held it out to me. "I made this," he said, "at my new house." I unfolded it after they were gone, after Renee had thanked me in a general way that said she probably didn't know the details of everything, and after Eli had waved from the end of the hallway and turned the corner and disappeared. It was a drawing. A house, like the drawing I'd glimpsed on his desk in November. But this house was different. It was drawn in bright colors, blues and greens, and a yellow sun that took up almost a quarter of the page. The way kids draw the sun when they're not trying to be realistic, but trying to capture something essential. There were stick figures outside the house, 3 of them, and they were clearly in the act of doing something joyful. Their arms were raised. Their legs suggested running or jumping. They had wide, simple smiles. And in the corner of the drawing, in that small, neat handwriting, I knew, he'd written, "I have a treehouse here too." I stood in the hallway for a moment after I read that. Barbara had gone back to her office. The classroom was behind me, 22 kids doing independent reading. Marcus probably tapping his pencil, Priya probably working through something quietly, all of them present and unknowing and fine. I folded the drawing back into quarters and put it in my pocket. I went back into room 14 and said, "Okay, 5 more minutes of reading, and then we're going to start packing up." 22 voices acknowledged this in various ways. Marcus looked up. Priya turned a page. "Lily lost her pencil?" and immediately started looking for it. I went to my desk and sat down. I still have the drawing. It's in the top drawer of my desk at home, in a folder where I keep a handful of things that matter to me in ways that are private and not entirely explainable. There's a letter from a former student, a photograph from my first year of teaching, a few other small objects that have accumulated meaning over time. The drawing is there, folded into quarters. I've thought many times, across the years since, about what the right way to tell this story is. Whether it's a story about following your instincts, or about the failure of systems, or about the particular kind of knowledge that teachers develop that has no formal name and doesn't fit into any rubric. Whether it's a cautionary story or an affirming one. I think it's probably all of those things. Which is to say, I think it's a story about the imperfection of everything, imperfect systems, imperfect rules, imperfect human beings trying to do the right thing with incomplete information under the pressure of time. The system I bypassed was imperfect. My decision was imperfect. The way things turned out was better than they might have been, but I can't know how much of that was because of what I did, or what CPS did, or what Renee and her family have given him, or what Eli himself carried into a new situation. I can only know what I did, and why, and what it cost, and what it may have been worth. There's something else I want to say, though I've hesitated about saying it because it sounds like the kind of thing that comes at the end of a story when someone is trying to tie things up neatly. But it's true, so I'll say it. About a year after all of this happened, I was in a professional development session, one of those long Saturdays where teachers from across the district sit in the high school cafeteria and talk about pedagogy and interventions and data. I was sitting next to a woman I didn't know well, another elementary teacher from a school across town. At some point, we started talking. The way you do during the breaks when you're both tired and slightly glazed, and she mentioned a student she was worried about. She described the situation in general terms, the quiet, the careful behavior, the instinct that something was wrong. I filed a referral, she said. But the process is so slow. I looked at her. She was probably 28 or 29, relatively new, with the particular exhausted alertness of someone in their first several years of teaching, when you're still absorbing the magnitude of the responsibility. "Can I tell you something?" I said, and I did. I told her enough, not everything, not Eli's name, but enough. I told her about the form, and the weight, and the decision. I told her that there were rules, and that the rules existed for good reasons, and that she should know them and generally follow them. And I told her that there was also her own judgment, and that after enough years in those rooms, that judgment could be more than nothing. She listened carefully. "Did it work out?" she asked. "I don't know everything that happened," I said. "But I know enough." She nodded slowly. We sat with that for a moment. Then the session started again, and we went back to being teachers at a professional development. Which is to say, we went back to doing the ordinary, unspectacular, endlessly consequential work of showing up in rooms full of children and paying attention. Paying attention. That's really what this is. 11 years now, 16, now going on 17, of learning to pay attention in a particular way. To see the drawing under the corner of the book. To hear the thing that a child writes when they think they're just doing an assignment. To notice the way someone looks at a clock on Friday afternoon. It is not heroism. It is not a rule. It is something closer to obligation, the obligation of anyone who has chosen to be present in a room where children are present, to be genuinely present themselves, to not look away from the things that are hard to look at. I went to CPS on a Tuesday in November because I could not look away. That's the whole of it. Everything else is context. The year Eli turned 15, I received a short email. It came through the school system's general teacher contact form. So it took a few days to reach me, and when I opened it, I sat very still for a long time afterward. It was from Renee. She said Eli was in high school now, that he was doing well in school, that he played soccer and had good friends and had recently started learning to play guitar. She said he still had the treehouse, that they'd expanded it, actually added a second level. She said he talked sometimes about his teachers from elementary school, and that there was one he mentioned often. She said she wasn't sure if it was appropriate to reach out, but that she'd wanted me to know. I wrote back. I wrote back that same evening, which is not something I always do promptly, but this I couldn't wait on. I said I was glad to know he was well. I said he had been a remarkable student. I said that I thought about him sometimes, and I was glad to know he had I didn't say anything else. Some things don't need to be said in order to be true. The alphabet border in room 14 has been replaced twice since November of that year. The carpet is different now, newer, still with the faint smell of whatever industrial cleaner they use. The desks are the same desks, or new desks that look exactly like the old ones. I've stopped being able to tell. Marcus grew up and moved on, and Priya grew up and moved on. And Dominic eventually made friends and stopped eating alone. Though that took until April and I celebrated it quietly to myself. 22 new children come through my door every August. Every year a little different. Every year the same in the ways that matter. I still notice the ones who watch the clock on Friday. I still crouch down when I talk to them. I still keep a notebook. The drawing stays in the drawer at home, folded into quarters, with its bright colors and its yellow sun and its 3 stick figures with their arms raised. I have a treehouse here too. I teach because of sentences like that. Because of the moments when you find out, after the uncertainty and the fear and the imperfect decision and the consequences you had to live with, that the thing you did when you chose to act, that it meant something. Not every story ends with a letter. Not every child comes back to find you in the hallway. But Eli did. And I will carry that for the rest of my life. The same way I carried the cases where I followed the rules and it wasn't enough. The same way every teacher carries the accumulation of all the children who have sat in front of them and needed something. You keep going. You keep paying attention. You learn to trust the things that have no name.